Welcome everyone to the George Kerferd Hotel. My name's Karen Thistleton. I'm the chair of the Kerferd Oration Committee. I would like to acknowledge and welcome our sponsor representatives here, Natalie McDonald, Vice President of Strategy and Development at La Trobe University, Trevor Areno, CEO of Indigo Shire, Michael Mack, CEO of WAW Credit Union, and we do have an apology from Peter Matthews, the Chair of the Board of Quercus, but we do have Jennifer Indian here representing the Board of Quercus. It's my pleasure now to hand over to our MC for today, Ailsa Cartledge. Lisa will be well known to many of you in the audience. She, perhaps more than most in this room today, shares a deep affinity about the power of walking and landscape with our orator. Please welcome Lisa.
Good morning. My name is Ailsa Cartledge. I'm the president of and founder of a group, Beechworth to Bridge. Beechworth to Bridge came about just over 5 years ago when I lost my husband to suicide. I had lived with suicide and the stigma surrounding suicide and mental health for over 30 years, as my father took his life in 1986. When my husband Sean took his life, I was adamant that my children would not live with the stigma that surrounded suicide and mental health. I found great solace in walking and talking, and so Beechworth to Bridge came about. Myself and an amazing committee formed Beechworth to Bridge, and we decided to just walk and talk. So, on the last weekend of March, we walked from Beechworth to Bright, over 3 days, 75 kilometres. We simply walk and talk. People who have been bereaved by suicide, are survivors of suicide, or continue to struggle with their own mental health, are encouraged to walk with us. We simply walk, talk and support. It's not a fun run and it's not a race. It's just a walk. And so, it is my great pleasure and honour to be able to be here today to introduce Ailsa, who also understands and appreciates the value in simply walking. It gives you great peace and solitude. Okay. And so, it is my great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Ailsa, who understands walking, albeit an 800-kilometre walk. The Kerferd Oration has always sought to challenge our collective thinking about issues in the community, thinking of ways to make a difference in Beechworth and beyond. We thank you all for being here this morning and consider that each and every one of you present is a very special guest. I would like to make special mention and welcome to Ailsa and Mr. Tim McCurdy, member for Ovens. The descendants of George Briscoe Kerferd, who I'll say a little bit more about later. Apologies have been received from a number of previous orators, federal, state and local government representatives, as well as community leaders across our region. Our distinguished orator, Ailsa Piper, is a writer, director, performer and dedicated walker. She worked for over 30 years as a writer, director, actor, speaker, teacher and broadcaster. As a writer, she works across many mediums. She was co-winner of the Patrick White Playwrights Award for her script Small Mercies in 2001. Published her first book, Sinning Across Spain, in 2012. Has written and performed an episode of ABC Radio's Poetica program based on that book. Ailsa co-adapted Bell Shakespeare's acclaimed version of The Duchess of Malfi in 2012. Ailsa's most recent book, co-authored with Tony Doherty, is The Attachment, Letters from a Most Unlikely Friendship. Please welcome Ailsa Piper to deliver the 17th George Briscoe Kerferd Oration.
Thanks so much, Lisa.
It takes enormous courage to stand up and tell that story, I'm sure, and you did it beautifully. Good morning to you all, and thank you so much to all of the Kerferd committee for trusting me to stand here today. And in particular, I'd like to say thank you to Judith Doughty, who is really responsible for me making it here. Sometimes all you need is one champion, one person to say you can do it. And she's been doing that for me for several months. So I have deep gratitude and admiration and respect for her. I'm not always easy to help. I'm a bit different to some of the other guests that you've had. I'm not an expert in anything. I don't have statistics to quote. I don't have a title or even a superpower. In fact, I don't even have a power suit. I borrowed an outfit to wear from a friend of mine, and I went to my room this morning to put it on after breakfast, and I stood in front of the mirror and I thought, that's not me. And I can't stand up in front of you and be someone else. So I'm afraid you're just left with this. No glamour and not even a pair of red shiny boots, sadly. But what I do have to offer are words. Words that I've stitched together into a story. It's not a big one or a political one. In fact, I think it might be familiar to many of you. But it has been crafted with care and gratitude because it's an honour for me to come back to Beechworth and to try to give something back to you. What do I mean by that? Well, Melbourne was my home from February 1987 until January 2015, 28 years almost to the day. And Beechworth was always a favourite destination for me and for my husband Peter. We thought it was perfect, surrounded by beauty, rich in history, changing with the seasons, and far enough from Melbourne so that by the time we arrived, we were always in holiday mode. Beechworth called to us many times in many weathers. Once it even called to Peter for work. He was a stage and screen actor, a beautiful one, and he got asked to make a promotional video for the Beechworth Bakery. This felt like reward for all those trips up and down the highway. So for me, no visit is complete until I've had a party pie from the bakery. Another visit, and one that I remember with deep gratitude, was when we came up here just before the publication of my first book. It was March the 5th, 2012. I was nervous and jumpy. Pete said I needed to get out and walk. So we set off for Beechworth and I roamed around the gullies and along the rail trail, taking photos of those beautiful orange rocks and the blue horizon, and I calmed. A bit like when I walked around the grounds here this morning to look at those trees, walking and looking. You know, one of the conundrums about walking for me is that when my body is in motion, in that repeated sort of drumbeat of step, 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 my mind goes very silent and still. Conversely, when I sit to meditate, which I do every morning, my mind's like the turnstiles at the MCG on Grand Final Day. Walking is my natural meditation. I'm at my best as a walker. Now, you'd think I'd remember that. It's not hard, but I don't always. And sometimes I need someone to just remind me to get out and walk. So Pete gave me good medicine with that trip to Beechworth, and I returned to Melbourne ready to send my book out into the world. That book is called Sinning Across Spain, as Lisa said. It's the story of a 1,300-kilometre walk that I made alone back in 2010. For 6 weeks I slogged through all weathers and all terrains, and mostly my mind was peaceful, even in the mud and the snow. Pete was back at home in Melbourne. He always called himself Base Camp. He liked to hear about my treks, but he preferred shorter strolls. He'd be thrilled to know that I was here, eating a pie, wandering under the bare branches, walking, with him and without him. Because, as you may have gleaned by now, Peter died. I've written about his death and the aftermath in magazines and newspapers, in the updated version of Sinning Across Spain. I also wrote about him in my second book, The Attachment, which is a book of letters between me and a priest named Tony Doherty. I tell you this because writing about Peter's death and the time after it helped me. Finding words was not always easy, but it's a thing I've done all my life. I grew up in the bush of Western Australia, red desert, no water, solitary, big distances. And from the first that I could put pen to paper, I wrote letters to distant relatives, grandparents, cousins, anyone basically who'd open an envelope. And then I discovered pen pals, and of course that opened up the world to me, and I wrote squillions of letters. In fact, correspondence became a lifelong addiction, and emails only fed it. So I also made up little stories back then for my family. I'd bore them rigid, and then I'd write plays for them to perform. For those reasons, it makes sense to me that I should have a book about walking and a book of letters. Walking has helped me to still so that I can sit to write. And words have framed my world and shown me how to negotiate it. If I can put words on a page, then I have made meaning from my experiences. So when the worst happened and there were no words, I set about trying to find them, to write them. And 3 years ago, I began my third book. It was called Still Life. Sound familiar? Let me tell you about it. It opens on a May morning in Melbourne, the morning after Peter died. Cold grey light streams in through the back windows of our home, and I'm staring at a collection of objects on our wooden coffee table. A still life, if you will. An apple core, browning at the edges. A chunky ceramic mug with some dregs of tea still in it. The Collins Easy Learning French Grammar book, its blue cover striped with yellow and pink. And lastly, the Oxford English Reference Dictionary, lying open at page 485. One of the words on that page, used to see, is marked in black pen with a tick and 2 brackets beside it. Interpreting that still life took barely a breath. It told of a ritual that I knew intimately. I'd been observing it for almost 30 years. Every day, Peter completed 30 minutes of French study, and every day he would read 5 pages of the Oxford English Reference Dictionary. Words would be underlined, ticked or bracketed if they had particular significance. Some would be transcribed onto the backs of used envelopes so he could revise later. Often there'd be a word that had to be shared with me, something so intriguing or delicious that it had to be discussed. And while he was completing his daily rituals, Peter always ate a piece of fruit and sipped hot tea. They don't go together, I used to say. And he'd raise that chunky mug and grin at me. Now I wonder sometimes, how many times did we ask each other that one-word question? Tea? 5 times a day, that'd be conservative. So we were together for 27 years and 8 months. That's roughly 10,095 days. Multiplied by 5, it's 50,475 times that we asked the question, tea? No wonder we had to bleach favourite mugs to remove the tannin stains. Tea was for sympathy and success, for comfort and crisis, for marking time and taking time. Tea was for talking. On that May morning, the tea dregs were grey and cold. Everything was grey and cold, and I was frozen, trying to make sense. I looked again at the still life, apple, mug, French grammar, dictionary, those annotations on page 485. Why the tick and the brackets? I stared at the word, straining for answers, for meaning. EUSTASY, eustacy. A change in sea level throughout the world caused by tectonic movements, melting of glaciers, etc. It explained nothing. Oh yes, a tectonic movement had occurred and I felt like I was melting, but I still couldn't make any sense. So I flicked forward to locate the word that kept repeating over and over like heavy footsteps in my head. Hemorrhage, from page 632 of Peter's Oxford English Reference Dictionary. An escape of blood from a ruptured blood vessel, especially when profuse. It happened on May the 18th, 2014, time unknown. He was alone in our bed, in our home in Melbourne. I was in Sydney, 1,000 kilometres north, calling and calling him. Calling his mobile, calling the landline, calling at shorter and shorter intervals, calling again. Until finally I rang our neighbour, a doctor, and I asked him to let himself into our house. It was after 10 p.m. And when he phoned back, he said 5 words. "Oh, Ailsa, I'm so sorry." Later, our doctor neighbour would tell me that he searched the house but found no note. At the time, I couldn't understand why he would say such a thing. Peter and I never spoke to others about his lifelong struggle with depression. Later, our doctor neighbour would say that he'd suspected because of a 7-word question Peter once asked in the front garden. "Do you treat many people for depression?" Later, even after it had been confirmed that Peter had died from a brain hemorrhage, I would still wonder if depression could have played any part in his death, though everyone insisted I was being irrational. This was random, they said. Unforeseeable bad luck. Luck. That little word enraged me. Pete used to call me the sunshine in the house. I was born glass half full. Brain chemistry, I guess. Luck. A friend once said that I was relentlessly happy. It stung, but it was kind of accurate. Of course I got sad and low, but when it happened there was a reason. I never experienced the dull hum of hopelessness or the racing panic of anxiety that shadowed my sister and my closest friend. I never felt like life was pointless, though depression was something I'd seen up close in Pete's eyes throughout our married life. Oh, not every day. Don't get me wrong. He was creative and funny. He was kind and curious. Marvellous company. But he could also slide into a state of such worthlessness and pain that he would say he had wasted his life. It was incomprehensible to me, and it was hideous to be unable to change it. But ironically, when Peter died in May 2014, he was well. He was making plans. He was healthy. In the previous 8 months, he'd found a counsellor who really helped him. And when he dropped me at the airport on our last meeting, he was heading off to meet with a real estate agent. He wanted to sell our home, move interstate, or maybe even overseas for a time. This was astonishing. Pete's depression had always made change excruciating. He got out of the car at Tullamarine that day, hugged me, and when I teared up, something really unusual for me because I love to get on a plane, he said, "Go on, go quickly so you can come back quickly. You know I love you." Now, after decades together, I think some of you might know this, it's rare to make declarations of feelings. But, I cling to those words now. That casually uttered statement, 5 little words, "You know I love you," has sustained me on many dark nights. I always tell people how I feel about them now. Sometimes I suspect it embarrasses friends when I end conversations with the word love. But I want to be sure that everyone who matters to me has no doubt where they stand, just in case. Anyway, Pete hugged me and got into his old silver car and accelerated away, his arm waving out the window. He was driving into the future, a bright future. That was the last time I saw him. And a week later, there I was, standing in our silent, empty house, looking at that still life. The cup, the apple core, and the 2 books, one of them meant to give meaning. After he died, I would consult it constantly, searching out the words that he had selected as important, staring at things underlined, many of them concepts I would never have guessed that would fascinate him, cross-referencing his curiosities, trying to understand what had made him tick and what had tickled him, wanting to see what I might have missed, to learn what I might have overlooked. But the dictionary confused me. It still does. And it was never going to give meaning to my days. You know, maybe the dictionary was another example of Pete being a flaneur. That was what he called himself. It's a French word meaning one who wanders without destination, who roams about in search of the overlooked thing. That was his way of walking and of reading. He had it put on his business card, Peter Curtin, actor, flaneur. He loved the French language, and one of his favourite books was Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Many of you will know it. It tells the story of a pilot whose plane crashes in the desert, where he encounters a little boy with golden hair. Over time, the pilot learns that the boy has come from another planet. The child is playful, but he's also irredeemably sad. He's lonely, and eventually he's gone. Pete's copy of the book falls open at the end of chapter 3, on the page where the pilot says, "If I am attempting to describe him, it is in order not to forget him. It is sad to forget a friend." Maybe that's why I've written so much about Peter. Maybe it's why I'm trying to find the words to tell you about him now. It is sad to forget a friend. You know, I've been an actor and a director, a friend, a daughter, a wife, but I think the words I've always found most helpful when I try to describe myself are walker and writer. I've been doing those 2 since childhood, and sometimes I've even managed to make a living out of them. But they have similarities in what they ask of me: curiosity, resilience, and, the hardest of all, patience. I can only get to the end of a long road by going step by step with eyes wide open. I can only make a story word by word, again, eyes wide open. I know this, but sometimes I get caught up and forget, like the days before we came to Beechworth. We all do. We all forget our best selves. This morning I thought I'd put on someone else's jacket and I'd be a better self somehow by standing in front of you in someone else's clothes. I bet you do it too. So just for a moment, I'm going to ask you before I go on to take a breath and think about the word that's yours, your best self. One that encapsulates all the things about you that help you. You can have 2 words if you want, I do. Is it friend, father, maker, baker, gardener, builder, whistler, listener? What holds your essence, your best essence? If you came today with someone, just turn to them and say it. Just say, "I am whatever." Just say it. Exercise your tongues for a moment. Oh, you've got a lot of best selves. I can see you're taking a lot more words than 1 each. Well, hang on to those words, because it's easy to forget our best self. It's easy for the voice inside to take over and give us another self that erodes, the part of us that actually is quite strong and quite resilient. That happened to me after Pete died. I became a thing I never wanted to be, a word I never anticipated. I was a widow. Widow, from page 1652 of Peter's Oxford English Reference Dictionary. A woman who has lost her husband by death and has not married again. That was me. But people hated me calling myself a widow. You're not, they'd insist, as though it was filthy or blasphemous. Well, I'd say, well, what am I then? You tell me. It was like the anger that I felt with polite words for death. Peter didn't pass. Pass what? Pass who? I was furious. I was a cross widow. Get it right, I would insist. Words matter. We have accurate words that are fit for purpose. Peter died. I am a widow. I struggled to work out what kind of widow I was. So I looked to stories, of course. Chaucer's lusty widow on her Canterbury pilgrimage had no appeal for me. She still doesn't. The black widow is a predator. In that version, I was likely to seduce any hapless man who crossed my path. Well, that's definitely not me. The crone was easier. She was quiet and solitary and required to be invisible for the rest of her days. She was like the woman around the corner who used to walk her chihuahua in the late afternoons and never raised her eyes. Young widow, inconstant, unpredictable. Those were words that I'd heard daily when I directed a play about a young widow. Back then I hadn't comprehended the fear behind them. You see, a widow is someone who has survived a brutal blow. Consequences are of little significance to her because she herself is of little worth now. In some places, widows throw themselves onto their husbands' funeral pyres. I knew I was not going to do that, but still. I didn't know what kind of widow I was. I hated it, and I hated myself. I could switch from anger to helplessness to recklessness to misery to rudeness to contrition to desolation in a heartbeat. Yet I withheld from tears. I would not cry. I would not weep. If Peter couldn't live, then I was not to be self-indulgent with my life. After all, I was here. So shut up, widow, and get on with it. I was a hard nut. Softness was not to be allowed. But you know, the world won't let you stay the same, and eventually a teacher comes. My first teachers were flowers. Vases colonised every surface of our home after Pete's death. Maroon peonies and white orchids, lilies, hydrangeas and roses, so many roses. Carnations and chrysanthemums, freesias and hyacinths, daffodils and jonquils, snapping dragons and tight tuberoses and unfurling tulips. You know, there's a language of flowers. It's called floriography. And according to its philosophy, certain blooms and bunches can convey meanings from the sender to the recipient. I wasn't aware of that then, but now I see how those flowers acted on me. Each morning I'd move through the still silent rooms of our house in the icy pre-dawn darkness, going from vase to vase, snipping and trimming, emptying and refilling, replacing and rearranging. I didn't know it, but this was the beginning of an instinct to make beauty, to become a creator of still lifes, if you will. So as I placed red roses, signifying romantic love, next to the yellow ones that symbolised devotion, I was unwittingly making a story about our marriage. The bird of paradise, which symbolises joyfulness, used to sit next to a favourite photo of Pete dancing on a beach. Irises, his favourites that he used to bring home when he did the supermarket shopping, symbolise faith and hope. I didn't know that, but I always put them on the mantelpiece where I could see them at night in bed. On my daily rounds, I removed leaves and shortened stems. I cut off thorns. I bundled up cuttings for the green waste. I didn't understand that I was caring for the flowers because I no longer had my husband to tend. They allowed me to feel that I was nurturing something. And then when they insisted on dying, I had to let them go. Dropped into the bin, smelling of decay and death, they were a reminder that even beauty must end. They taught me more than any reassurances from doctors or coroners, friends or family that I couldn't keep anything alive beyond its time. Everything has a season. Everything must and will die. It's part of why our days are so precious. I still get reminders of the lessons and language of flowers. Just the other day, a camellia, and did you know that the camellia is related to the tea plant? A camellia dropped from its stem in my bedroom in Sydney. Yes, I live in the harbour city now. Remaining in Melbourne was too painful. So in the space of 8 months, I sold or gave away almost everything we owned, and I drove up the Hume Highway in my black Toyota Corolla, detouring to stay overnight in Beechworth and to have a party pie and a cup of tea at the bakery. And then, after weeks of hunting and disappointments, I found a flat near the entrance to the harbour. And 12 months to the day, on the first anniversary of Pete's death, I woke for the first time in my new home. It was a mad year. But now I live between 2 lighthouses, and that's a symbol that does not escape my notice. Each of them is 20 minutes walk from my door. Downhill there are quiet coves and sheltered bays where sailboats bob and ferries lob. Behind me there are golden sandstone cliffs and the wild Pacific Ocean. Tall palm trees grow beside angophoras and vast ancient figs. The air smells of salt and frangipani. And just to the east is the Gap, which is a place where many people have ended their lives. And they still do. They climb over the fence and they jump or fall onto the rocks below the path where I now walk most days. You may think it a strange place to have chosen to live. And truthfully, I didn't think about it until after I arrived. I don't think I was thinking very straight about anything except the desperate need to stop running, to find home, to be still again. But from the first, living near the Gap was oddly reassuring. Daily, as I walked along the fence line by the cliff edge, I told myself that I was still on the side of life, the side of dancing blue wrens and flowering wattle and basking blue tongues. With each walk along the fence line, if I kept my eyes on the birds or the passing whales, the muscles in my shoulders would loosen just a little. If I concentrated on the lemony scent of a magnolia flower, my heart would stop its relentless roaring. When I stopped to pick up a fallen banksia pod, the tightness in my chest would release. And when I could focus on the teal blue of a kookaburra's wing, the anxiety and panic which had claimed me and continued to hold me for a full year began to abate, just a little. I started to believe, step by step, that the people I loved would not die if I took my eyes off them. And when I stared down my lifelong fear and learned to swim, a thrilling new world opened. Slowly, I allowed my body to immerse in salt water, and I began to believe that grief might even be dissolved in that water. Tony, my co-author of The Attachment, says that most things can be fixed by salt, that tears, sweat and seawater are great healers. I hadn't let myself shed many tears, but I sweated plenty and I swam whenever I could. I wanted to describe the miracle of my new life aquatic. So I began to write. Hooray. I wanted to honour the gift of beauty, the solace of it. And I also wanted to investigate its connection to despair. Because on my bad days, and there were still plenty of those, even if I walked through a drift of frangipani blossoms or past a brilliant crimson hibiscus, I didn't register them. They weren't there. On those days, I could only see my dark interior world. But if I could lift my eyes, beauty was always waiting for me. I only had to let it in just a little, petal by petal, wingtip by wingtip, to feel fractionally lighter. I wanted to write about this line, this connection that I was walking along the cliffs, where beauty and despair intersected. I also wanted to write about the little still lifes that I had begun to make around my flat, groupings of objects that held pieces of my story. Perhaps they were an antidote to the still life of that first morning, I don't know. But from the day I moved in, I started doing it. And still, even now, I make and remake them. One of my favourites is displayed under a glass dome that was given to me by a friend when I left Melbourne. In it, I've put a tiny ceramic snail to help me to remember to slow down, and beside it is a matchbook from the restaurant in New York's Twin Towers, where Peter and I had lunch decades before planes flew into the buildings and the world changed forever. Next to that is a miniature pottery bowl with my name etched onto the bottom of it. It was made for me by my mother the year before she died of cancer at the age of 57. Beside that, there's an exoskeleton of a seahorse to remind me of the colony that makes its home down at the beach where I swim each day. And lastly, there's an acorn, just like the one I picked up out the window there a few minutes ago. And it's to reassure me that big things can grow from very small things. That still life contains the past, the present, and some future hopes. It's as though I've found a new way to make sense and meaning, object by object. I look at the still life as the afternoon sun catches it. I'm at my dining table with my computer open in front of me. Now that golden light falls on a ceramic mug. It's not Peter's. I didn't keep it. I kept almost nothing of his. I do have his binoculars. Sometimes I like to feel that I'm looking at the world through his eyes. And now I realise that just like him, I've let my tea go cold because I've been immersed in words. I'm trying to string some together, word by word, step by step, tea by tea. I think the mug might be my 7th for the day. The light moves again and touches the corner of a pile of paper to my left. There are 230 pages stacked there. It's a draft of my novel, which is now called Still. Well, it might be called Still. I've had to stop working on it, maybe for good or maybe for a while. I don't know. You see, I made an error. It turns out that the grieving process doesn't actually involve neat, continual, incremental recovery, and that even the relentlessly happy can fall into despair. In the last 6 months, my book became garbled and messy. I was also trying to write this oration, and it became garbled and messy. Words fell in the wrong order. And then one day in January, I fell. I crashed into the pavement, smashing my forehead and gashing my knee. Not long after that, I looked at the cliffs, and for the first time ever, I understood what it might feel like to climb over the fence and choose to fall. It felt like it would be relief. I did know that I was in trouble. Writing wasn't keeping me on the life side of the line. So I went to a counsellor, as I had counselled Pete to do so many times, and I sobbed like a lost child. I gulped and gasped. I couldn't stop the tears. And here's the thing, I lost control. I was out of control. And I heard myself say to her, if I can just finish this bloody book, then I can be finished with grief. She laughed. She couldn't help herself. And then I did too, though that didn't stop the tears. They'd been waiting for 5 years to fall, so they weren't going to dry up in one sentence. If I can finish this book, I can be finished with the grief. If I can write this oration, I can be finished with my grief. It's hilarious, isn't it? I mean, it's insane. What it is a control freak on steroids. So I had to give it up. There was terrible grief in that too. Another death, 3 years of work, all those words, tens of thousands of them. But the problem was that I had been forensically examining the past, day in, day out. Although I was writing about still lifes and nature and swimming, the things that have helped me, I was also spending most of my daylight hours in the time after Pete's death. As a result, I was dreaming it too. Or some nights not dreaming because anxiety would keep me awake. All my focus was on the worst days, the days after his death, his ashes flying back onto my bare legs, discarding all the objects of our life together, his depression, what might have been. I forgot the Beechworth visits and the party pies. I forgot our shared afternoons sitting on couches reading to each other. I even forgot his belief in me, his championing of me. My sister once said when I was railing about something that it was important to remember that I had had 28 years with a good, kind, funny man and that some people never got to have a day of that. She was right then and she's still right. I had forgotten the good. I was opening and reopening a wound by writing, and I was ignoring the lessons of walking. I was literally sitting in my own despair. So, it's time to let the wound become a scar. Grief won't go away, but hopefully if I can get out and walk and open my eyes to the gifts of time and tea with friends, the birds on my balcony, the darting fish beneath me as I swim, the smiles of strangers and the wagging tails of dogs, then my grief might form into a good strong scar, like the one on my knee from the fall I took back in January. It's red and lumpy, but it speaks to me of my capacity to recover. Scar, from page 1292 of Peter's Oxford English Reference Dictionary. A usually permanent mark on the skin left after the healing of a wound, burn, or sore. I've come to think of my scars as an alternate life story, a memoir etched into my flesh and my mind. I am my scars, and they are me. And they're you too. So before I conclude, I would just like to invite you to think for a moment about a scar somewhere on your body. I can't believe you could have got through life without one. Then I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and just show them the scar, or if it's covered up, tell them about it. Tell them how you got it. Tell them where you got it. Tell them when you got it. But take a minute to honour a scar and the fact that you have healed from a wound. Go! Okay, I'm going to stop you. You can talk about your scars over a cup of tea in a minute. You know what? You wouldn't have found it nearly so easy if I'd asked you to talk about the perfection of your body, would you? I'm a firm believer that talking about our scars and our brokenness helps us speed the healing, even when it feels hard or confusing. So, take a few minutes to talk about scars every week. There is a second definition of that word in Pete's dictionary. Scar, too. The lasting effect of grief, etc., on a person's character or disposition. I would like the lasting effect of grief to be gratitude. That's what I've decided. Gratitude for the gentle compassion of my grandmother who died 40 years ago, and for the patience of my war veteran grandfather who died not long after. Gratitude for the dark humour of my glowing girlfriend who died of anorexia 38 years ago. And for the wicked daring of my friend Tim who died of an overdose 6 years later. Gratitude for the tender love of my mother who died 25 years ago, and for the joy and challenge of my friend Greg, who I nursed as he lay dying and he drove me crazy. For the endless laughter and nonsense and playfulness of the actor mates I've farewelled in the past decade. And still, and always, for the persistent curiosity and wonder that I saw in my flaneur husband Peter, even as he battled with the darkest depths of depression. Having tasted it so briefly in recent times, well, not depression, despair, there is a difference, I think. I am even more awed by the courage of those who make honourable and kind lives while they live with that dark and hungry dog. Gratitude. I don't need to look up that definition. I feel it in my bones. If I want grief to give me anything, I want it to remind me that still, life is a gift and that it's there for the taking in both hands. It's to be gobbled and chomped and inhaled and swum and walked, always walked. It's to be received with open arms for as long as I can breathe, and maybe even beyond. Who knows? I don't. As I said at the beginning, I don't know much of anything. But if there are two words I'd like to be able to say every day for the rest of my life, they are these: the lesson of grief. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank those members of the Kerferd family who are in Beechworth with us this morning. Ray and Robert Kirkwood and Denise Bernicle, grandsons of George Briscoe Kerferd, who have travelled to be with us today with their partners Beth and Sue. Welcome back to Beechworth. The George Briscoe Kerferd medal was crafted by George Frimmel of Melbourne and has an image adapted from an 1870 print from the Burke Museum collection. On this occasion, I invite Ray Kirkwood to present the medal to Ailsa.
It's great that it's been all about walking. Could I give you my crutch? There. Put this up here. I'd like to thank Ailsa for her wonderful oration this year on her talking about her walking, and part of it was singing across Spain. She joins an illustrious group of speakers and further enhances the reputation of the oration. Thank you. I'm sure George Briscoe would have been able to identify with her putting one foot in front of the other. In part, it is part of family folklore that he walked from Melbourne to Bendigo to be a miner when he first arrived in Victoria. I know she has asked her friends for their sins to be carried and absolved on her journey. I would have been happy for her to have taken mine, but she may have been exhausted by the burden and never completed the trip. In research for today's talk, I was surprised, and I'm sure this will also surprise Ailsa, to find that we are literally related. Ailsa, in a previous life, some may remember, acted in a minor TV show called Neighbours from 96 to 99. Her most dramatic time in the show, the episode which won an AFI award, came when her son, Ben, arrived unexpectedly. Ben happens to be my nephew. So literally, we're related. I was wondering, does this make you my sister-in-law? And he has sent his regards along with somebody else, Peter Dodds, who happens to be another friend. He was the director and producer of the series. It's a small world. On behalf of the organising committee and descendants of the George Briscoe Kerferd, I'd like to present this medallion to you to commemorate your wonderful oration. And could you put your hands together again for her? Whoop. Now, I have to put this over your head.
Wow.
Well done.
Oh, thank you so much. Maybe I'll get one for swimming one day.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Thank you.